Greetings and welcome to the Roundtable rendition of Careful Conversations, a program made possible by the collaborative efforts of AARP Colorado and Dementia Friendly Denver. My name is Jane Barton. I'm honored to serve as the Caregiving Ambassador for AARP, as well as the co-host for this roundtable discussion today. I'm the founder of Cardinal LLC, and as such I serve as a speaker, writer, listener, and I specialize in the areas of aging, illness, end-of-life care, and caregiving. So as you might imagine, I am excited about this roundtable discussion about the real and raw issues of the caregiving journey. And I'm also very honored to serve as a co-host with Lori LeMasters, as well as our fabulous guest today. Before diving into our discussion today, allow me to introduce the amazing people who have gathered at the table. First, it's my delight and privilege to be co-hosting this roundtable with Lori. Now, Lori is the founder of Care Partners Resource, a free membership website to assist family caregivers with the daily challenges of caring for a loved one. She works with professionals and family caregivers to identify their needs as a caregiver, to understand the feelings of burnout, and to create practical, effective plans for self-care. Currently, Lori is on the steering committee for Dementia Friendly Denver. It is Lori's passion for caregivers that served as the catalyst to convene this discussion today, a compassionate and beneficial conversation about the journey of caregiving. So thank you so much, Lori. I would like to introduce Kim Mooney and certainly welcome you today. Kim is the founder of Practically Dying. She has worked with hospices and as an independent consultant for faith communities, corporations, healthcare, and mental health agencies. She is a thanatologist certified by the International Association of Death Education and Counseling, a keynote speaker, a published author, and a former member of the board of directors of the Association of Death Education and Counseling. She is currently an end-of-life consultant through her company, Practically Dying. I would also like to welcome Luis Medina, Dr. Luis Medina, a member of the University of Colorado Hospital Neuropsychological Clinic. Dr. Medina assesses adult patients with various cognitive problems and neurological disease. Dr. Medina is also involved in Alzheimer's disease research. He was awarded a research grant from the Alzheimer's Association to examine how understanding the relationship between cognition, daily function, and disease markers can improve the diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's disease, and other dementias in Hispanics and Latinos. So welcome to both of you. We are delighted to have you here. Now that we know a bit about the people at our table, it's time to consider and discuss some important questions about the caregiving journey. So Lori, if you could share a bit about the caregiving survey that was conducted, and that will help to prepare our guests for some of the questions that you will pose here in the future.
Sure. Thank you, Jane. So when I began thinking about this discussion, it was extremely important that we focus on actual daily issues that caregivers have in their lives. And we felt in order to hear from many caregivers from all walks of caregiving and all walks of life, we wanted to reach out to a large number of caregivers. And so to do that, we sent the survey to constituents from Parkinson's Association of the Rockies, Alzheimer's Association, A Little Help, as well as caregivers that Jane and I have met over our years of speaking. So today's discussions are going to be based on common challenges that came up in those survey responses. So let's begin with the first question. We asked caregivers, what caregiving concerns keep them awake at night? Many caregivers, like Charles in Lakewood, commented that they needed help understanding and dealing with sadness, fears, and grief. So anticipatory grief is experienced by caregivers as they witness incremental changes prompted by their loved one's aging and/or progressive illness. What resources or education are available for caregivers and other family members regarding the grief process?
Well, I'll be glad to take that one. I'd like to start by saying that I think it's really important to understand what grief is, because we have very disenfranchised ideas about it. Some people think it's all emotion or all sadness, and it can be emotions that we don't want to have, like anger. It can be frustration. It can be fear. It also can be very physical. There are people who don't express emotionally, but they have stomach pains, or they're, really, they take it out physically. So there are lots of different ways that we grieve that people don't recognize or respect. That's one thing that's really important, and the way the process unfolds. So there are people who are what we call instrumental grievers. They may not be the ones who want to sit and talk and look into your eyes. They may want to be the ones that in the old days would build the coffin, would actually do things. So they're going to need different kinds of support. And because it is a process, people need different things at different times. So we've mentioned before in these other sessions, which were very good, getting individual support, maybe sitting down with one of the persons who's going through the same kind of loss you are, being in a support group so you're in community. There are lots of online resources. There are also times when, and the word came up before, respite. People frequently misunderstand grief and consider it depression. And there's a very clear line between clinical depression and depressive grief. And one of the differences is that in grief, you lift out of it every so often. So we've had people who've told me, I feel really guilty. I had a great day. I laughed. I went to a movie. And I say, yay. That breathing in and out is a natural way to go through grief. And if we don't do that, we actually are going to be, as we've said in these other sessions, very beautifully, overwhelmed, frustrated, frightened because we think we're alone. We don't understand the process, and that's particularly true in grief. It's very easy to feel like you're crazy, to look at the altered state you're in and think, I'm never going to come back. We have trouble visioning the future, so it becomes more and more isolating. I would also like to say that I think all of life is a grief process, and certainly aging is a grief process, and it's a beautiful example of what happens when we live with losses constantly and we are receiving the gifts that come from being in bigger and bigger truths. So none of it is bad, but so when I hear the term anticipatory grief, I want to take it apart, because there is no anticipation. It assumes, it's true that there's a death, that there's an acute event, but all of the grief that goes into letting go of the past, all the grief in that moment, and all the grief wrapped up in the future are all part of, I would just say, be judicious in the word anticipatory, because it sounds like that event is coming and everything along the way is less than. And sometimes, as we know with people who are dying of long, slow illnesses, so many people grieve along the way. As my mother, that when my stepfather died of Pick's disease, people said, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you grieving? And she said, I just spent 7 years saying goodbye. So if you don't understand what it is, it's easy to be or feel judged. So resources come from everywhere.
I think you bring up some really good points. I think the idea of process, and some have mentioned how life is a chronic illness, right? Where from the moment we're born, we begin the dying process, and I know you and I have had this discussion before, how a lot of these end-of-life issues don't come suddenly. Even, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, other dementing illnesses like Pick's, frontotemporal dementia, these are known to have a gradual onset with a progressive decline, much like the aging process, just a little sped up. So it's not like something you wake up one morning and, oh my goodness, I can't remember anything. I must have Alzheimer's disease. Folks with Alzheimer's disease have started to see those declines for a while now. And a lot of the research actually shows that the processes and the changes in the brain that happen before a lot of these illnesses start years before we even notice the first of these symptoms. And so when you start noticing those symptoms, the other thing that you mentioned was this idea of community and being able to sort of find that community, embrace that community before things get worse. And in a lot of the cross-cultural research, there's this notion of how we here, especially in the United States and in some Western countries, fall into this happiness trap. That we're supposed to be happy all of the time.
Right.
And so therefore, when we live our lives consistent with this notion of, I need to focus on the positive, I need to belittle or mitigate or negate the negative, when it comes time to something that's as natural as the grieving process and death and dying, this becomes extremely hard for us. We've spent the rest of our lives or the majority of our lives pushing those ideas away, these negative, potentially negative ideas, that when they finally confront us or we have to confront them, it becomes much more challenging. And so that's why we see some cultures where death and dying is considered just as natural as waking up and falling asleep, that their grieving process is very different from ours.
And we have such unrealistic expectations
Correct.
of the journey. You know, we hear things that, oh, we're going to get over this. Or I just have to go through the 5 steps, according to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and it's a linear progression. And I had one woman come up to me, she was so excited, and she said, I'm depressed today. That's stage 4. I'm almost done. And I was like, oh my gosh. So we had to have a cup of coffee and talk about this. But it goes to education, which, Kim, I know you do a lot of. People don't understand grief, and they certainly don't understand how to effectively mourn their grief. And those are 2 different things. And they need to recognize and name their grief. Because a lot of people, when you talk about grief, they assume a death loss. But there are all these other things we lose along the way that need to be addressed.
And if it's not addressed, as I said with depression, it's called something else. It's symptomized. So all of a sudden you're just an angry person, or you're a depressed person, or you're a drag. And it takes, I think, because we are in a bit of an altered state. We kind of psychically blow out. It's too much oftentimes, which is also, let me say something else in a second, but it takes community to reflect back to you the normalcy, and it also takes community just to hold you while you're going through this, so that even if you feel like you're never going to come out, there is a sense around you, a human, we talk about the difference between personal grief and the grief of being human. And when you're held in community, everybody knows you're going to get through it, regardless of what you think, which I think is really important. But when we're talking about resources, the other thing I realize is that people who are grieving, and particularly people who are caregiving, are so overloaded that it's important to give them the right thing at the right time. So it's wonderful to get thousands of books and lots of advice, but what I found mostly is people want to know what is going to help them deal with what is right in front of them in that moment. And there's skill around that. There's skill.
Absolutely. And that falls to the sadness piece too. All the talk, I want to clarify for our caregivers that are watching us, that as we're talking about grief, we're not really talking about that you've lost your loved one. We're talking about through the process of caring for their loved one. There's so much grief involved. The dynamic that has changed within the relationship, the losses that you are suffering from no longer working and not having those relationships, or the relationship with your loved one, so there is grief all along the caregiving process that I think caregivers need to acknowledge and recognize and accept and allow. Go through that process, because the sadness, the fear, and the grief kind of all go together as part of the process.
And as long as that there's some aspect of loss, you have the potential for grief. And if you start seeing that, like you mentioned, this loss of community, this loss of connections, this loss of work, or this loss of activities that you used to do that you either don't find the time for, or just not in the mood for, all of that is loss. And therefore, with that, you have the potential for grief throughout that.
And this is also interesting when I saying the right thing at the right time, because the worst thing that can happen is someone can give you really good advice at the wrong time. Like somebody who is 2 years away from a loss can say, oh, don't worry, you'll get over it, when you're feeling like, oh, what if I forget that person or that event? So it's got to be skillful, but in a more almost an esoteric level, when we are ripped apart, when we are annihilated, what often comes back is a more valued reality. What often comes back, I know very few people who've gone through intense loss who haven't come back as more centered, more open, and more drilled down on what's important. Not a good time sometime to tell them that, but as all these losses happen, they do eventually, for 99.9% of the people, come back with more depth. You are the phoenix rising from the ashes, if you will. So that part of the grief process it again has to be said skillfully, but it is about annihilation. It's also about rebirth. And the humbling that comes when you live through that kind of a fire is, I think, what changes you. So when we're talking to caregivers, it is, I think, critical to remind them of what they are getting, to help them see what they are getting, because that's the nourishment that comes with the starvation of losing your identity.
Right. And through that process also, I think that having a plan or planning and talking about things is so very important and can help some of that process, right? So many caregivers who responded to the survey, there was a lot of discussion about legal issues, things related to legalities and whatever. However, if you ask them, well, have you had the conversation, right, with your loved one? What are the finances? What are the wishes? What are the plans? It's so complicated, they just don't even go there. So how can we encourage families to discuss and thus avoid problems in the future? And also, how does culture enter into those discussions?
Sure. Yeah, like I mentioned before, this idea of the happiness trap, right? And you mentioned how things get complicated with some of these end-of-life issues. And so people avoid things that make them feel bad. And there's also this other notion of agency, this idea of perhaps sense of control. And and this has been shown for decades in a lot of research, that when we don't have a sense of agency, a sense of some control, that we can get depressed, we can feel sad, we can feel powerless, and that raises our anxiety. And so one of the things that we always recommend is that in order to optimize and increase your sense of agency, things like planning and planning early are really important. So I used to do work with inpatient and outpatient geriatric patients who were 60s, 70s, 80s, and did not have an advance directive, did not have end-of-life plans. And so as they got closer, as they got ill, they started feeling like things were no longer in their hands, that they didn't have a sense of control. And that's just in healthy aging. As for folks who are in the dementing populations, they're starting to also lose that mental ability. So they start losing that sense of agency. I can't even remember what I had for breakfast this morning. How am I supposed to plan anything?
Right.
And so my recommendation has always been to plan early. Start having those conversations early. In the context of cultural aspects, there are folks who have this idea of internal agency and others that have an external locus of control or an external agency. So for people, and again, Western cultures tend to have a lot of that internal agency. For them, it's themselves starting to think about, what do I need to do to get my advance directive? Do I need to, the next time I talk to my primary care, see if the clinic has somebody that I can talk to? For people with external locus of control and external agency, a lot of them rely on family, rely on their immediate communities, rely on those that are around them to start having those conversations, and so that they may actually initiate or need the family to initiate that with them at an early age. Going back to this idea that a lot of these end-of-life issues don't happen overnight. When you start seeing those changes, whether it's healthy aging or less successful forms of aging, when you start seeing those changes, being able to sort of say, hey, maybe it's time I start having that conversation. Maybe it's something as simple as, I don't feel comfortable driving anymore. And how do I start arranging something as simple as transportation, giving up my keys, handing over my car, and building from that.
Well, I think giving up your car is one of the biggest grief processes that people go through in this country. The change in identity, mobility, that's
Independence.
Yes, it's terrifying. In a lot of the work I do around advanced care planning, this comes up. How do we start the conversations? And so I know many tricky doors, because sometimes you have to be, you know, you have to be very skillful. So certainly coming in by way of the financial pieces or other pieces that are technically end of life, but they're not about your physical body. I find people are fascinated talking about death until it gets to them. So there are lots of ways to bring it up, and then there's some ways like just looking at what's on TV or talking about abstract deaths. You get a little bit closer in and you can talk about deaths of other people, maybe. But this piece of control, oftentimes I'll say to a family member, if you don't do this, you will lose control. And the sense of wanting to not lose control will be a catalyst. The other things I see are telling family stories, almost doing a life review. So as you bring values to light, it's easier to apply those to end-of-life decisions than to sit down and say something that's not effective, like, do you want CPR? You know, so to bring the stories in very different ways, I think, is very helpful. And also it is, again, about community, because we say we're autonomous. We are never autonomous. Our families and our friends define what happens to us. So having those conversations over and over allows people to get more comfortable with it. I remember one time listening to a man respond to an audience member who said, "Is it okay to be terrified of death?" And he said, "Yes." And I thought, no. It's okay to be scared of death, but when you're terrified, you're immobilized. You know, and fear is a healthy thing. Fear is actually one of the best things about death, because it wakes you up. You don't waste time when you remember, you know, that you're mortal. So those conversations can be started from many different points that aren't scary. And then they can move into you, but they don't even have to land on you medically right away. They can begin to talk about what you want the culmination of your life would be. And honestly, I think there are two really important reasons to do this. And one is so you don't end up in a medical emergency at the end of life. And the other one is that the legacy that it leaves your family is optional and horrific. When they feel like they haven't been able to help, when they've seen things happen that weren't okay.
It can cause family conflict.
Forever, yes.
Forever.
Yes.
Destroy families.
Absolutely.
Forever.
Yeah.
I know with my mom, what ended up happening towards the end, and that allowed her to go into hospice, was very interesting, because we really hadn't talked about it, hadn't thought about it. And she was in the hospital for some blood reasons. Her blood was too thin at the end, and but otherwise she was, sounds crazy, but otherwise she was really healthy. But before they sent her home, an intern came in, and he said, have you thought about hospice for your mom? And I freaked out immediately and said, she's not dying. No, we're not talking about this. And he said, well, let me just have someone come in and talk a little bit about the benefits of hospice. And they came in and started talking, and my mom was like, And then they said, and she, pointing to me, will get 13 months of therapy once you're gone, grief support when you're gone. And my mom said, she couldn't speak at the time, she was a stroke survivor, but she said, sign me up. It wasn't about her, and it wasn't about her fears. It was about her fears for me when she passed. And so once we got there, she actually was, every hospice person that came to our house said she's going to break records. She'll be around for years. And she passed in a week.
Wow.
In the most beautiful way, honestly, ever. But it was her understanding that I was going to be okay.
Exactly. And there's that sense of community that works again, a community of people who aren't afraid. And one other thing that I remember is, this has happened more than once, a caregiver who says, I promised him I would take care of him. I can't have them come in because I said it.
Yes.
And to be able to reframe that as, this is too much, and if you let them do their work, you are taking care of him. And it just frees people up to see it.
And then you can go back to being the daughter or the spouse or the whatever at that time.
Yeah.
And I think culturally that is something that comes up a lot, especially with the communities that I work with, where you know, Hispanics and Latinos, there is that idea that we, the younger generation, have to take care of the older generation. In Asian cultures, the same thing, and in many others. And so there comes this time when we have to have those tough discussions. I've worked a lot with very early forms of Alzheimer's disease, where the person's in their 40s and 50s, and they start having immobility problems. They're very stalwart in what they want to do, and very stubborn, and their spouses may not physically be able to take care of the needs of that individual. And having that discussion with a Hispanic Latino family of, hey, maybe it's time to discuss hospice or assisted living or some other type of nursing care becomes very challenging.
Yeah.
Well, we certainly appreciate all your comments today. And as with the other roundtable discussions that we've had, we could stay here for another hour or two, because I love talking about, this sounds very strange, but I love talking about grief, probably because I knew so little about it when I had such a significant loss. When my mom died, I was only 24, and I had no idea what to do with it. And so knowing people that are experts in the field now, and learning on my own and through education and learning at the feet of caregivers that I've met along the way, it's like, wow, we've got to spread this information so people have the tools that will alleviate some of the unknowns and alleviate some of that fear and allow them to move through that process. Because there is the afterglow of adversity. There is rising up from the depths of despair and actually having an enriched life. It's different, but there's something to be gleaned from that.
Yes, absolutely.
And the conversation, certainly something we all need to have sooner rather than later. So I love your ideas about how to do that.
Yes.
Maybe in a sneaky way, but hey, whatever it takes, right, to get there. So in closing, I would like to thank our guest for participating in our conversation today about caregiving. No doubt their comments, suggestions, and insights will prove beneficial to anyone tuning into our program today. And I certainly want to thank you for joining us today at the round table. I hope that you will be inclined to share this video with family, friends, colleagues, maybe clients that you serve, and perhaps even view the videos together, have a discussion, debate, chew over some of these ideas and suggestions, and perhaps bookmark this video for future reference. Each time you tune into this video, you will hear something different or differently based on where you are in your respective journey. Thanks to the collaborative efforts of AARP Colorado and Dementia Friendly Denver, we enjoyed the opportunity to host 3 sessions of the roundtable rendition of Careful Conversations. We hope you find each session to be beneficial, empowering, and motivational. That is ultimately the why of our collective efforts. So take good care, and I wish you and yours many blessings in your caregiving journey.